The children's table was set with the second-best china, positioned strategically in the corner of my parents' dining room, where it wouldn't interfere with the real conversation happening at the mahogany table that seated 12. I stood in the doorway of the Sterling family home, taking in the scene that would have broken my heart 5 years ago, but now merely confirmed what I'd always known. In my family's hierarchy, I ranked somewhere between the hired help and the family dog. "Kaylee, sweetheart," my mother Margaret called out, her voice carrying that particular blend of affection and dismissal she'd perfected over the past 28 years. "You're just in time. We've got your spot all ready for you." She gestured toward the smaller table where my 16-year-old niece Emma was already seated, looking mortified on my behalf. The main table gleamed under the crystal chandelier, set for the adults who mattered. My parents, my sister Victoria, and her husband David, my brother Jonathan, Aunt Helena, Uncle Thomas, and 3 empty chairs presumably for guests who had yet to arrive. I smiled and walked toward my assigned seat without argument, ignoring the flash of surprise that crossed Victoria's face. She'd probably expected me to protest, to demand a place at the grown-ups table like I had during family gatherings throughout my 20s, but I'd learned the value of choosing my battles, and tonight was not about where I sat. "Hi, Aunt Kaylee," Emma whispered as I settled into the child-sized chair that made my knees bump against the table edge. "This is so stupid. You're 28 years old." "It's fine, Em," I said, meaning it. "How's junior year treating you?" As Emma launched into stories about her AP classes and college preparation, I let my gaze drift to the main table where the real Sterling family drama was unfolding. Victoria was radiant in a way that only came from receiving exactly the kind of validation she'd been raised to crave. Her honey blonde hair was styled in the kind of elegant updo that required professional assistance, and her navy dress probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "I still can't believe it," Victoria was saying, her voice pitched to carry throughout the room. "Senior partner at 32, the youngest in the firm's history. We're so proud of you, darling," Margaret gushed, her manicured hands clasped in delight. "Crawford, Mitchell & Associates is such a prestigious firm. The signing bonus alone," Richard added, swirling his bourbon with the satisfaction of a man whose daughter had just validated every investment he'd made in her education. "Enough to buy that house in the Hamptons you've been wanting." I watched this celebration of Victoria's achievement with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a familiar tribe. There had been a time when witnessing these moments of family pride that was never directed toward me, would have sent me spiraling into self-doubt and desperate attempts to prove my worth. But tonight, I felt only a calm anticipation that had been building for months. "Kaylee," Uncle Thomas called out, his judge's voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "How are your little computer hobbies coming along?" Computer hobbies. As if 5 years of 18-hour days building something from nothing could be dismissed so easily. As if the sleepless nights, the failed prototypes, the countless rejections and small victories that had led to this moment were nothing more than a child playing with toys. "They're going well, Uncle Thomas," I replied, my voice steady. "Thank you for asking. Still working at that. What was it? Coffee shop?" Victoria asked, her tone suggesting she was trying to be kind while also making sure everyone understood the vast gulf between her professional achievements and my apparent lack thereof. "I left the coffee shop a while ago," I said simply. "Oh, good." Margaret's relief was palpable. "Have you found something more suitable? Perhaps an office job with benefits?" Emma shot me a look of solidarity that almost made me laugh. She was the only family member who'd ever bothered to ask real questions about my work, the only one who understood that there might be more to my life than what I chose to share at family gatherings. "I'm doing fine, Mom. Really? Well, we just worry," Margaret continued. "At your age, you should be thinking about your future, about security, about finding a nice man and settling down like Victoria did." I glanced at David, Victoria's husband, who was nodding along with the conversation while scrolling through his phone. Their marriage was exactly the kind of strategic partnership my parents had always envisioned for their children. 2 successful lawyers building a power couple dynasty that would produce the next generation of sterling overachievers. "Actually," I said, setting down my water glass with deliberate precision, "I've been thinking a lot about the future lately, about security and success and what those things really mean." "That's wonderful, dear," Margaret said absently, already turning her attention back to Victoria's detailed description of her new corner office. I caught Emma's eye and winked. She grinned back. sensing that something interesting was about to happen even if she couldn't predict what. The truth was, I'd been planning this moment for months, waiting for exactly the right opportunity to show my family who I really was. Tonight, with Victoria basking in the glow of her partnership and the entire Sterling clan gathered to worship at the altar of traditional success, the timing couldn't be more perfect. In 30 minutes, everything they thought they knew about me would change forever. The pattern started early, maybe when I was 7 and Victoria was 11. She'd won the county spelling bee while I'd gotten detention for disrupting class, after questioning why we had to memorize multiplication tables when calculators existed. Even then, I'd been asking the wrong questions, challenging systems that weren't meant to be challenged. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" became my mother's favorite refrain, usually delivered with the exasperated sigh of someone who'd drawn the short straw in the genetic lottery. Victoria got the beauty, the social skills, and the intuitive understanding of how to navigate the Sterling family's unspoken rules. Jonathan got the athletic ability, the natural leadership qualities, and the kind of easy charm that made adults want to invest in his future. I got the stubbornness, the inconvenient curiosity, and an apparent inability to care about the things that mattered to everyone else. School became my refuge, but not in the way my parents hoped. While Victoria excelled at student government and debate team, activities that showcased the kind of leadership skills that looked good on college applications, I disappeared into computer labs and advanced mathematics courses that my family saw as antisocial hobbies rather than legitimate interests. "She's so smart," teachers would tell my parents during conferences, "but she doesn't apply herself to the right things." The right things. As if intelligence was only valuable when channeled into pursuits that impressed country club friends and college admissions officers. By high school, the family roles had crystallized completely. Victoria was the golden child, destined for legal or political greatness. Jonathan was the heir apparent to Richard's business empire. And I was the family experiment that had gone wrong. Too smart for my own good, but not smart enough to figure out how to use that intelligence appropriately. The breaking point came during my senior year, when I'd been accepted to MIT with a full scholarship for computer science. Instead of celebration, I got lectures about practicality and concerns about my future marriage prospects. "Computer science is fine as a hobby," Richard had said, barely looking up from his newspaper. "But you need to think about a real career, something stable, teaching maybe, or nursing." "What about law?" I'd suggested. "Like Victoria? Victoria has the personality for law," Margaret had replied. "You're more technical, analytical. It's different. Different." The word that had defined my entire childhood, always spoken with the subtle implication that different meant lesser, meant wrong, meant something to be corrected rather than celebrated. So I'd gone to MIT with my full scholarship and my family's tepid support, calling home every week to hear about Victoria's law school achievements and Jonathan's business internships. My Dean's List honors were met with polite congratulations. My early graduation was acknowledged with a card. My acceptance into the graduate program earned a 5-minute phone conversation before Margaret pivoted to discussing Victoria's engagement. The final straw came at Victoria's wedding 3 years ago. I'd been relegated to reading a brief scripture passage during the ceremony while Jonathan gave the toast and walked her down the aisle alongside Richard. At the reception, I'd sat at table 12 with family friends' children and distant cousins, watching my siblings command the spotlight with the natural grace I'd never possessed. That night, in my hotel room after the reception, I'd made a decision that changed everything. I stopped trying to prove myself to people who were fundamentally incapable of seeing my value. I stopped seeking approval from a family that had already decided I wasn't worth their investment. Instead, I started building something that belonged entirely to me. The app idea came from frustration. My own frustration with data management systems that were needlessly complicated and expensive. Working from my tiny Boston apartment, surviving on ramen noodles and determination, I'd spent 18 months developing a platform that could streamline data analytics for small and medium businesses. The first year was brutal. 16-hour days, failed investor meetings, rejection letters that questioned whether a young woman really understood the technical complexity of enterprise software. But I'd learned persistence from years of being dismissed, and I'd learned self-reliance from a family that had never quite figured out what to do with me. Dataflow Solutions launched quietly, with 3 clients and a website I'd built myself. No fanfare, no family announcements, no requests for startup capital from Richard's investment connections. Just me, my code, and a growing conviction that I could build something significant without anyone's permission or approval. I'd moved back to Portland after graduation, ostensibly to save money while getting my business off the ground. My family assumed I was struggling, maybe even failing, and I let them believe it. When they asked about my work, I mentioned freelance consulting and small projects, allowing them to draw their own conclusions about my limited success. It was easier that way. Easier than trying to explain growth metrics and user acquisition to people who still thought of computers as expensive toys. Easier than watching them struggle to understand how their disappointing daughter had built something they couldn't categorize or dismiss. For 3 years, I'd lived in their shadow while building my own empire in silence. And now, sitting at the children's table while they celebrated Victoria's partnership, I finally understood what I'd been waiting for. I'd been waiting for this moment, when their assumptions about me would collide with reality in the most spectacular way possible. The coffee shop job had been perfect cover, exactly the kind of employment my family expected from their underachieving daughter. 25 hours a week at Grind Coffee, just enough to pay rent on my studio apartment, and maintain the illusion of barely scraping by. What they didn't know was that I was working another 60 hours a week from that same studio, building something that would eventually change everything. My real office was a corner of my 400-square-foot apartment, equipped with 3 monitors, 2 laptops, and a server setup that hummed quietly behind blackout curtains. The neighbors probably thought I was running some kind of cryptocurrency mining operation, which wasn't entirely wrong. I was mining data, finding patterns, creating solutions that traditional software companies had missed or ignored. Dataflow Solutions started with a simple observation. Small businesses were drowning in data they couldn't effectively analyze. They had customer information, sales trends, inventory patterns, and marketing metrics scattered across a dozen different platforms, but no affordable way to synthesize that information into actionable insights. The big consulting firms charged 6 figures for custom analytics solutions. The existing software required PhD-level expertise to operate effectively, and the small business owners I'd met during my coffee shop shifts were smart, driven people who deserved better tools than Excel spreadsheets and guesswork. So I built it myself. The first prototype took 8 months and nearly killed me. I was surviving on 4 hours of sleep, subsisting on whatever food I could grab between coding sessions, and burning through my savings faster than I'd anticipated. There were nights when I questioned everything. My abilities, my sanity, the likelihood that anyone would actually want what I was building. But then, the first beta test came back positive, then the second. Then I had a waiting list of potential clients who'd heard about my platform through word of mouth and wanted access to something that could give them the kind of business intelligence they'd never been able to afford. The breakthrough came during my 3rd year, when a mid-sized retail chain agreed to pilot my platform across their 15 locations. Within 6 months, they'd increased their profit margins by 18%, just by optimizing inventory based on my analytics. Word spread quickly after that, retail to restaurants to service companies, each success story leading to 3 new clients. I incorporated officially on a Tuesday morning in September, sitting in a lawyer's office downtown, while my family thought I was at my coffee shop job. Dataflow Solutions became a real company with real employees, all 5 of them working remotely, all of them brilliant programmers and data scientists who believed in what we were building. The first major acquisition offer came 8 months later. A Fortune 500 company that specialized in business software had noticed our growth trajectory and wanted to buy us for $12 million. I turned them down, not because the money wasn't life-changing, but because I knew we were worth more. The second offer was for $22 million. I turned that down too. By the time the third offer arrived, $45 million from a tech giant that understood exactly what we'd built. I had 93 employees, offices in 3 cities, and a client base that included some of the most successful small businesses in the Pacific Northwest. I said no to that one as well, but it clarified something important. I wasn't building Dataflow to sell it. I was building it to prove that the family disappointment could create something more valuable than anything my siblings had achieved through traditional measures of success. The hardest part wasn't the technical challenges or the business development. It was maintaining the facade of struggling failure while my company grew exponentially. I kept the studio apartment, kept the minimal lifestyle, kept showing up to family dinners where they discussed my lack of direction with the kind of gentle concern usually reserved for discussing terminal illnesses. Maybe you should consider going back to school, Victoria had suggested at Jonathan's birthday party last year. Get an MBA, learn some business skills that could help you find a real career. I'd nodded thoughtfully, as if considering her advice, while mentally calculating the quarterly revenue numbers I'd be reviewing the next morning. Dataflow had just signed our largest contract ever, a 3-year deal worth $8 million with a national restaurant chain that wanted to revolutionize their supply chain management. "That's not a bad idea," I'd replied. "I'll think about it." The deception had become almost automatic. When they asked about my work, I mentioned small freelance projects and the occasional consulting gig. When they worried about my finances, I let them believe I was living paycheck to paycheck. When they offered to help with rent or groceries, I accepted just enough assistance to maintain credibility while privately donating 10 times that amount to local nonprofits. Emma was the only family member who'd ever asked detailed questions about my computer work, and even she didn't understand the full scope of what I'd built. She knew I was doing some kind of tech stuff, and that I seemed happy with my choices, which was more insight than anyone else had bothered to develop. Tonight, sitting at the children's table while Victoria celebrated her partnership, I realized that the secret-keeping phase of my life was finally over. Dataflow Solutions was about to go public with a valuation that would put me in the same league as tech entrepreneurs who made headlines in Forbes and Businessweek. More importantly, I was about to acquire Crawford, Mitchell & Associates, Victoria's prestigious law firm. "Emma, darling, tell us about your college plans," Aunt Helena commanded from the head of the adult table, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 60 years organizing other people's lives. "Your mother says you're considering pre-law." I watched my niece straighten in her chair beside me, unconsciously mimicking the perfect posture that had been drilled into every Sterling child since birth. "Actually, I'm more interested in computer science and business," Emma said carefully. Like Aunt Kaylee, the silence that followed was deafening. I could practically hear the collective wince from the main table as Emma committed the cardinal sin of suggesting that my educational background might be worth emulating. "Oh, sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice dripping with gentle correction. "Computers are fine as a hobby, but you'll want something more substantial for your career. Something with prestige, like law," Victoria added helpfully. "Emma, you have the intellectual capacity for something really challenging. Don't limit yourself." I felt Emma stiffen beside me and placed a subtle hand on her arm. She'd been dealing with this kind of pressure her entire life, the assumption that her interests were somehow less valid if they didn't align with traditional Sterling family values. "Computers are where the future is," Emma said, with the kind of passionate conviction that reminded me of myself at her age. "Aunt Kaylee has been teaching me about data analytics and app development, and it's actually really complex and interesting." "Teaching you?" David looked up from his phone for the first time all evening, his expression suggesting he'd just heard that I'd been instructing Emma in recreational drug use. "It's just basic stuff," I said quickly, not wanting to draw too much attention to my role in Emma's education. "Some coding fundamentals, how to think analytically about problems." "Well, that's nice," Jonathan said, with the patronizing tone he'd perfected as a middle manager climbing the corporate ladder. "But Emma, you should focus on developing skills that will actually help you in the real world." The real world. As if the digital transformation happening across every industry was somehow fictional. As if the billions of dollars flowing through tech companies were monopoly money. As if the platform I'd built that was currently processing millions of transactions every month existed in some alternate dimension. "What John means," Victoria clarified, shooting her brother a look that suggested he was being too blunt, "is that while computer skills are useful, they're better as tools to support a traditional career rather than as a career themselves. Right, Kaylee?" She was giving me an opening to agree, to reinforce the family narrative that my choices had been well-intentioned mistakes rather than calculated decisions. The old Kaylee would have taken it, would have minimized her own achievements to avoid making her successful siblings uncomfortable. "Actually," I said, setting down my fork with deliberate precision, "I think Emma's instincts are exactly right. The most successful businesses today are the ones that understand how to leverage technology effectively." "Oh, absolutely," Richard nodded condescendingly from his position at the head of the table. "We use computers all the time in banking. Very important tools, but someone still needs to make the actual business decisions." "Of course," I agreed mildly. "Someone needs to understand the strategic implications of technological capabilities." "Exactly," Margaret beamed as if I'd finally said something sensible. "That's why Victoria's new partnership is so exciting. Crawford, Mitchell & Associates represent some of the biggest technology companies in the region. They're the ones making the real decisions about how these computer companies operate." I felt a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "They represent tech companies?" All the major players, Victoria said proudly. We handle their corporate law, their intellectual property issues, their acquisition strategies. It's incredibly complex work. You have to understand both the legal framework and the business implications of emerging technologies. That sounds fascinating, I said, genuinely meaning it. Which companies specifically? Victoria launched into a detailed explanation of her firm's client roster, clearly enjoying the opportunity to demonstrate her expertise. She mentioned data management companies, software developers, analytics platforms, and emerging tech startups that were reshaping entire industries. With each name she dropped, I felt the pieces of my plan clicking into place more perfectly than I dared to hope. Crawford Mitchell and Associates wasn't just any prestigious law firm. They were positioned at the heart of the exact industry I'd been building my empire within. It must be exciting to work with so many innovative companies, I said. Do they ever discuss acquisition strategies? How they identify promising targets? Oh, constantly, Victoria replied, warming to her subject. Just last month, we facilitated a major acquisition. A Fortune 500 company purchased this small data analytics firm for an absolutely stunning amount. The owners made out like bandits. How much? Emma asked, genuinely curious. Victoria glanced around the table, clearly enjoying having the full attention of the family. $87 million, for a company that barely anyone had heard of 5 years ago. I nodded thoughtfully, doing rapid mental calculations. $87 million for a data analytics company. That's interesting. The tech bubble, Uncle Thomas said dismissively. These valuations aren't sustainable. Mark my words, it'll all come crashing down just like the dot-com boom. Maybe, I said quietly. Or maybe we're just seeing the beginning of a fundamental shift in how business operates. The conversation continued around me, but I was no longer listening. I was thinking about timing, about impact, about the perfect moment to reveal that the family disappointment had built something more valuable than anything they'd achieved. That moment was coming very soon. Dessert arrived with the kind of choreographed precision that only happened when Margaret had spent weeks planning every detail. Crystal bowls of chocolate mousse, garnished with fresh berries and gold leaf, were placed before the adults, while Emma and I received slightly smaller portions in everyday glassware. Even the dessert service reinforced the hierarchy. This is absolutely divine, Margaret, Aunt Helena pronounced after her first spoonful. You must give me the recipe. Oh, I couldn't take credit, Margaret demurred with false modesty. It's from that little French bakery downtown. But I did specify the presentation. I thought the gold leaf added such an elegant touch. I watched this performance of effortless sophistication with the detached amusement of someone who'd witnessed it countless times before. Every Sterling family gathering followed the same script, carefully curated displays of wealth and taste, conversations designed to reinforce everyone's position in the family hierarchy, and subtle competitions over who could demonstrate the most refined appreciation for life's finer things. Speaking of elegant touches, Victoria said, smoothly transitioning the conversation back to her favorite topic. The renovations at Crawford, Mitchell are finally complete. They've completely redesigned the senior partner offices. Italian marble, hand-carved furniture, the works. As they should, Richard said approvingly. Image matters in corporate law. Clients need to feel confident that they're working with the most successful firm available. Absolutely, David agreed. First impressions are everything in professional services. The physical environment has to communicate competence and success before you even speak. I found their fixation on surface appearances both fascinating and tragic. How much energy they invested in creating the illusion of importance rather than building actual value. But then again, I'd learned something important from watching them. Perception could be just as powerful as reality if you knew how to use it strategically. Kaylee, Uncle Thomas called out, apparently deciding it was time to include the children's table in the conversation. You must appreciate good design, given your technical interests. I imagine those computer companies spend quite a bit on their offices. Some do, I replied carefully, though you'd be surprised how many successful tech companies started in garages or coffee shops. Well, yes, started there, Helena said with the tone of someone correcting a child's misunderstanding. But once they become real businesses, they invest in proper facilities. No serious client wants to meet in someone's garage. That's true, I agreed. Growth requires different kinds of infrastructure. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her expression taking on the intensity she usually reserved for cross-examining witnesses. Have you given any thought to what you want to do long-term, Kaylee? The freelance consulting can't be sustainable forever. Here it was, the opening I'd been waiting for. The perfect moment when the entire family was focused on my apparent lack of direction, when their assumptions about my limited prospects were most firmly entrenched. Actually, I said, setting down my spoon and folding my hands in my lap, I've been thinking about that a lot lately. That's wonderful, Margaret exclaimed, her relief palpable. We've all been hoping you'd start planning for your future. What kind of planning? Jonathan asked. Are you thinking about going back to school? Getting some business training? Or maybe exploring more traditional career paths? Victoria suggested. I could introduce you to some contacts in corporate recruiting. Nothing high-level initially, but there are good entry-level positions for people with technical backgrounds. I looked around the table at their expectant faces, at people who loved me, but had spent my entire life underestimating me, who genuinely believed they were offering helpful guidance to someone who needed rescuing from her own poor choices. That's very generous, I said, but I think my career path is already pretty well established. Oh? Helena raised an eyebrow. Have you found a position somewhere? Not exactly, I replied. I've been working on building something of my own. The pause that followed was filled with the kind of gentle concern usually reserved for family members who'd announced their intention to become professional gamblers or interpretive dancers. Building something? Richard's voice carried the cautious tone of someone approaching a potentially unstable situation. What kind of something? A company, I said simply. A company, Victoria repeated slowly, as if testing the words for hidden meaning. What kind of company? Data analytics. Business intelligence software. The kind of tools that help companies make better strategic decisions. Oh, sweetheart, Margaret said, her voice thick with sympathetic understanding. That sounds very ambitious, but starting a business is incredibly difficult. Most small companies fail within the first few years. Mom's right, Jonathan added. The failure rate for startups is astronomical. Maybe you should consider partnering with an established firm, learning the business side before trying to go out on your own. I nodded thoughtfully, as if seriously considering their advice. You're probably right about the risks. Most startups do fail. Exactly, Victoria said, clearly relieved that I was acknowledging reality, which is why it's so important to have realistic expectations and maybe explore some alternatives. Although, I continued, my voice taking on a slightly different tone, some companies do manage to succeed despite the odds. Well, yes, David said, but those are rare exceptions, and they usually require significant capital investment, business expertise, market connections, all things that take time to develop. I agreed. Unless, of course, you've already developed them. What do you mean, already developed them? Victoria's voice had taken on the sharp edge she used when questioning witnesses who weren't being entirely forthcoming. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, scrolling to the email I'd been waiting 5 months to share. The subject line alone would change everything. Crawford, Mitchell & Associates. Acquisition complete. I said, holding up the device so they could see the screen, that as of 3 o'clock this afternoon, I own Crawford, Mitchell & Associates. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions. Confusion, disbelief, and finally a kind of dawning horror, as the implications began to register. That's impossible, she whispered. Is it? I turned the phone toward her so she could read the entire email. Dataflow Solutions completed the acquisition this afternoon. Crawford. Mitchell is now a subsidiary of my company. Dataflow Solutions? Richard leaned forward, his investment banker instincts kicking in despite his shock. I've never heard of that company. Most people haven't, I replied calmly. We've been deliberately low profile while we focused on growth, but we've been acquiring strategic assets for the past 18 months, building a comprehensive portfolio of complementary businesses. Victoria was still staring at my phone screen, as if it might change if she looked hard enough. This has to be some kind of mistake. Crawford. Mitchell isn't for sale. We're a partnership, not a corporation. You can't just buy us. Actually, I said, pulling up another document. You can, if you understand the ownership structure correctly. 43% of the firm's equity was held by Morrison Financial Group, which has been looking to divest their legal services holdings for the past year. Morrison Financial... Uncle Thomas's voice trailed off as he recognized the name. They also owned controlling interests in 2 other law firms and a consulting company. I continued. Dataflow purchased the entire portfolio for $215 million. The number hit the table like a physical blow. I watched my family process what I'd just told them. Not just that I owned Victoria's law firm, but that I'd spent more than $200 million acquiring it. $215 million, Jonathan repeated slowly. You're saying you have access to that kind of capital? I'm saying I have significantly more than that kind of capital, I corrected. The Morrison acquisition was about diversification, not leverage. Margaret had gone completely pale. Kaylee, I don't understand. How is this possible? Where did you get that kind of money? I built it, I said simply. Dataflow Solutions has been growing exponentially for the past 4 years. We went public 6 months ago with a valuation of $847 million. $800 million, David breathed. That was 6 months ago, I clarified. Our current market cap is just over $1.2 billion. The room erupted in shocked voices, everyone talking at once, but I only had eyes for Victoria. She was staring at me with the expression of someone whose fundamental understanding of reality had just been shattered. You're a billionaire, she said. On paper, yes, though most of that is tied up in company equity. I paused, letting that sink in. My liquid assets are considerably more modest, only about $127 million in cash and traditional investments. Only, Helena repeated faintly. The point is, I continued, Victoria, you're absolutely right that image matters in corporate law, which is why one of my first priorities will be completing those office renovations you mentioned. Italian marble is elegant, but I'm thinking we might go with something a bit more cutting edge. Victoria found her voice finally. You can't seriously be suggesting that you're going to run Crawford, Mitchell. I'm not going to run it, I said. You are. You're an excellent lawyer, Victoria, and the firm's clients trust you. I have no intention of interfering with the day-to-day operations. But you own it. I own it, I confirmed. Just like I own the building it's housed in, and the investment fund that manages the partners' retirement accounts, and the insurance company that underwrites your malpractice coverage. Jonathan was frantically calculating something on his phone. If your company is worth over $1 billion and you own 63%, I supplied helpfully, then you're worth more than the rest of this family combined, I finished, including the trust funds, the real estate holdings, and Dad's investment portfolio. Richard looked like he was going to be sick. This is really real? You've really built a $1 billion company? Really real, I confirmed. Would you like to see the Forbes article? It comes out next week, but I have an advance copy. I pulled up the article on my phone. The Data Queen. How 28-year-old Kaylee Sterling built a tech empire from her studio apartment. The coffee shop, Margaret said suddenly. You were never really struggling, were you? I was never struggling, I agreed. I was building. Emma, who had been silent throughout this entire revelation, suddenly started laughing. This is the best thing ever, she said. Aunt Kaylee, you're like a secret superhero. I grinned at her. Something like that. But why? Victoria's voice was small, vulnerable in a way I'd never heard before. Why didn't you tell us? The question I'd been expecting. The one that would require the most honest answer I'd ever given my family. Why didn't I tell you? I repeated Victoria's question, letting it hang in the air while I considered how to explain 28 years of feeling invisible to people who were finally, truly seeing me for the first time. Because, I said slowly, I wanted to know if you could love me when you thought I was nobody special. The words cut through the silence like a blade. I watched my family's faces, seeing the moment when defensive anger gave way to something that might have been shame. Kaylee? Margaret started, but I held up a hand. Let me finish, I said. For my entire life, I've watched this family celebrate achievements that fit a very specific definition of success. Victoria's law degree, Jonathan's promotions, even Emma's AP classes, all measured against standards that never seemed to include anything I was good at. I turned to face the main table directly, abandoning any pretense that this conversation belonged at the children's table. Do you know what it's like to watch your own family discuss your lack of direction at every gathering? To have your intelligence dismissed as stubbornness and your interests labeled as hobbies? To be 28 years old and still relegated to the kids' table because you don't fit their definition of a successful adult? We never meant, Richard began. Yes, you did, I interrupted. You absolutely meant it. Every single time. When you asked why I couldn't be more like Victoria, when you suggested I needed business training to function in the real world, when you offered to help me find an entry-level position with someone else's company. Victoria was crying now, silent tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. We were trying to help you. Were you? Or were you trying to fix me? I pulled out my phone again. scrolling to a different email. Because while you were also concerned about my lack of direction, I was building something extraordinary. Want to know what I've accomplished in the past 5 years? I began reading from my notes. Dataflow Solutions has 847 employees across 6 countries. We've processed over $2 billion in client transactions. We've created 12,000 jobs indirectly through the businesses we've helped optimize. Our platform has improved profit margins for over 3,000 small businesses, helping them compete with major corporations. I looked up at their stunned faces. I've personally donated $18 million to educational nonprofits, including the computer science program at Portland State that's now named after me. I've funded coding boot camps for underserved communities, sponsored scholarships for women in technology, and created internship programs that have launched hundreds of careers. We had no idea, Helena whispered. Because you never asked the right questions, I replied. When I told you I was working on data analytics, you heard computer games. When I mentioned business intelligence software, you heard unrealistic dreams. When I tried to explain what I was building, you offered me advice about finding a real job. Emma, who had been listening with wide eyes, suddenly spoke up. That's why you kept it secret. Because you wanted to see if they'd value you without knowing about the money. Exactly, I said, grateful that at least one family member understood. I wanted to know if the little girl who asked too many questions and challenged the wrong systems could be loved for who she was, not what she achieved. But we do love you, Margaret said desperately. We've always loved you. Have you? I asked quietly. Or have you loved the idea of me? The potential you saw for me to become someone more acceptable? The question hung heavy between us. I could see them struggling with it, trying to reconcile their intentions with the reality of how their behavior had affected me. Every family dinner, every phone call, every birthday card has carried the same implicit message, that I'm not quite enough as I am, that I need to be fixed, guided, rescued from my own poor choices. I paused, letting that sink in. Do you understand what it's like to love people who fundamentally don't believe in your judgment? Jonathan cleared his throat. So, all those times you seemed to accept our advice, you were just humoring us? I was hoping, I said. I was hoping that eventually you'd see past your preconceptions and notice that I was actually doing fine, better than fine, that I was building something remarkable. Why now? David asked. Why reveal everything tonight? I gestured toward Victoria, who was still struggling to process the fact that I now owned her law firm. Because Victoria just celebrated becoming a senior partner at a prestigious firm, and the entire family gathered to honor that achievement. It seemed like the perfect time to point out that prestigious firm now belongs to the family disappointment. You're not a disappointment, Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. Aren't I? I challenged. Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like the only thing that's changed in the past 30 minutes is your perception of my net worth. Are you proud of me now because I've built something valuable, or because you finally understand that I was never actually failing? The silence stretched between us, filled with years of misunderstanding and missed opportunities. Both, Victoria said finally, her voice thick with tears. God help me. Probably both. At least she was being honest. You want to know the worst part? I said, standing up from the cramped children's chair and walking to the window that overlooked the manicured garden where I'd spent countless childhood hours, feeling like an outsider in my own family. It wasn't the dismissal or the constant suggestions for how I could improve my life. It was the loneliness. I turned back to face them, these people who shared my DNA but had never really known me. Do you have any idea what it's like to achieve something extraordinary and have nobody to share it with? To hit every milestone I'd dreamed of since childhood, and know that calling home would just result in more advice about finding stability? The memory of those moments hit me with unexpected force. The night Dataflow hit our first $1 million in revenue, when I'd sat alone in my apartment with a bottle of champagne, wanting desperately to call someone who would understand what it meant. The day we signed our largest client, when I'd driven to the coast and walked on the beach for hours, carrying a celebration that belonged to no one but me. 3 years ago, I continued, when Dataflow was valued at $50 million for the first time, I drafted an email to all of you. I wanted to share what I'd built, wanted to finally show you that your weird little sister had figured out how to turn her computer hobbies into something significant. What happened to the email? Emma asked softly. I deleted it, I said, because I realized that your reaction would have been about the money, not about what I'd accomplished. You would have been proud of my success, not proud of me. Margaret was sobbing now, the kind of silent crying that spoke to deeper grief than simple regret. We failed you. You failed to see me, I corrected. There's a difference. You're not bad people. You're just people who built your entire worldview around very specific definitions of success and value, and I never fit those definitions. I walked back toward the table but remained standing. Being seated felt too much like accepting the subordinate position they'd assigned me for 28 years. Victoria, I said, focusing on my sister. Remember when I was 16 and I told you I wanted to study computer science? What did you say? Victoria's face crumpled as the memory surfaced. I said you should focus on subjects that would help you get married. And Jonathan, when I showed you the prototype for my first app 3 years ago, what was your response? My brother looked down at his hands. I said it was a nice hobby, but you should focus on getting a real job. Dad, when I graduated summa cum laude from MIT with a double major in computer science and economics, how did you introduce me to your colleagues at the alumni dinner? Richard's voice was barely audible. I said you were still figuring out what you wanted to do with your life. And Mom, I turned to Margaret, when I tried to explain what Dataflow did, what did you say? I said it sounded very complicated, and asked if you'd met any nice young men at work. Margaret whispered. Each of you, I said, my voice carrying the weight of years of accumulated hurt, responded to my achievements by either diminishing them or redirecting the conversation toward your own expectations for what my life should look like. I pulled out my phone again and opened a photo album I'd created but never shared. These are pictures from the last 5 years. My team celebrating our first major client, the ribbon-cutting ceremony when we opened our Seattle office, the technology conference where I gave the keynote address to 3,000 industry professionals, the day we rang the opening bell at NASDAQ. I scrolled through image after image of moments that should have been family celebrations, graduations from executive leadership programs, awards ceremonies, business dinners with investors and partners who'd become genuine friends. Every single one of these moments, I thought about calling you. I thought about sharing what was happening, letting you be part of the joy. I locked the phone and put it away, but I knew the conversation would end with suggestions about how I could leverage these opportunities to find a husband or transition into a more appropriate career. We were worried about you, Helena said, her voice defensive but uncertain. You were worried about your image, I replied. About having a daughter who didn't fit the Sterling family template. About what people at the country club would think when you couldn't easily explain what I did for a living. The accusation hit its mark. I could see the recognition in their faces, the acknowledgement that their concern had always been as much about themselves as about me. So I stopped trying to fit into your world. I continued. I built my own world instead. A world where asking questions was valued, where challenging systems was rewarded, where being different was an asset rather than a liability. A world without us, Victoria said, understanding finally dawning. A world without your judgment, I corrected. A world where I could succeed without constantly defending my choices or apologizing for my interests. Emma suddenly stood up from her chair. That's not fair to Aunt Kaylee, she said, her teenage voice carrying surprising authority. You're all sitting here feeling sorry for yourselves, but she's the one who spent years pretending to be struggling so you wouldn't feel bad about how wrong you were about her. Emma's words cut through the room like a sword, and I felt a surge of gratitude toward my 16-year-old niece who understood the situation more clearly than any of the adults present. The silence that followed her observation was different from the shocked quiet that had greeted my earlier revelations. This was the silence of people being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. Emma's right, I said, settling back into my chair but maintaining the authority I'd claimed. I've spent the last 5 years managing your feelings about my success, making sure you never had to confront how completely you misunderstood me. I opened my laptop, the same device I'd been carrying to family dinners for years while they assumed I was just checking email or playing games, and pulled up a presentation I'd prepared months ago, but never expected to use. Since we're finally having an honest conversation, I said, let me show you exactly what I've built. The first slide showed Dataflow's headquarters in Portland, a sleek, modern building with floor-to-ceiling windows and the kind of innovative architecture that had been featured in design magazines. This is where I work. 47 floors, green building certification, and a rooftop garden that provides fresh produce for our employee dining facilities. Click. The next slide showed our employee statistics. 847 full-time employees. Average salary, 73% above industry standard. Comprehensive benefits including full health care, child care assistance, and equity participation for every employee from entry level to executive. Click. Financial projections for the next 5 years. Conservative estimates put Dataflow's valuation at $2.8 billion by 2029, assuming moderate growth rates and no major acquisitions. Acquisitions, Richard repeated, his investment banker training kicking in despite his emotional state. Like Crawford Mitchell? Crawford. Mitchell was the smallest acquisition, I said, clicking to the next slide. Over the past 18 months, Dataflow has purchased controlling interests in 17 companies across 4 industries. We're building an integrated technology ecosystem that can serve businesses from startup to enterprise level. I showed them our client list, companies they'd heard of, corporations whose products they use daily, brands that represented billions of dollars in annual revenue. Dataflow wasn't just successful, it was becoming infrastructure. The Forbes article that comes out next week will rank me as the youngest female CEO on their billionaire list, I continued. At 28, I'm apparently the fastest person to build a billion-dollar company from bootstrap funding. Bootstrap funding? Jonathan asked. No investors, no venture capital, no loans. I built Dataflow entirely from revenue generated by the company itself. I closed the laptop and looked around the table, which means I answer to no one but myself and my employees. The implications of that statement settled over them like fog. I wasn't just wealthy. I had the kind of independent power that couldn't be influenced or controlled by outside forces. What does this mean? Margaret asked, her voice small and uncertain. For us, I mean. For our family? That depends, I said, on whether you're asking because you're genuinely interested in rebuilding our relationships, or because you're worried about how my success might affect your social standing. It was a harsh question, but a necessary one. I'd watched too many families torn apart by sudden wealth, seen too many relationships destroyed by the toxic combination of money and ego. Both, Helena admitted, with the kind of brutal honesty that reminded me why I'd always respected her despite our differences. I wish I could say it was purely altruistic, but I'd be lying. I appreciate the honesty, I said. So let me be equally direct about what comes next. I pulled out a folder I'd prepared for this moment, documents I'd hoped I'd never need to use but had created as insurance against exactly this scenario. First, I said, the vacation house in Mendocino that the family uses every summer. I bought it 6 months ago when the owners decided to sell. You're welcome to continue using it, but it's mine now. Richard went pale. The Hendersons sold the house? They retired to Arizona. The sale was handled quietly through a management company. I turned to Emma. There's a college fund in your name now. Full tuition, room and board, and living expenses for undergraduate and graduate school, regardless of where you choose to go. Emma's eyes filled with tears. Aunt Kaylee, I can't. Yes, you can. And you will. No sterling woman should ever have to compromise her dreams because of financial limitations. I turned to Victoria. Crawford, Mitchell will continue operating exactly as it has been. Your partnership is secure, your clients are protected, and I have no intention of interfering with the firm's culture or practices. But Victoria, you work for me now. That's not a threat. It's simply the new reality. Victoria nodded mutely, still processing the fact that her little sister had become her boss. For everyone else, I continued, our relationship moving forward depends entirely on your ability to accept that I'm not the family failure you've spent 28 years trying to fix. I'm successful, I'm happy, and I'm not interested in your opinions about how I could improve my life. What if we want to improve our relationships with you? Jonathan asked quietly. Then you'll need to start by getting to know who I actually am, I replied. Not who you think I should be. 6 months later, I stood in the grand dining room of my new estate in the West Hills, watching the catering staff make final preparations for what had become a monthly tradition, Sterling family dinner, hosted by me. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd purchased the house from a family whose patriarch had made his fortune in the same investment banking circles as my father, though on a considerably larger scale. The dining room could seat 20 comfortably, with a table crafted from a single piece of reclaimed teak, and surrounded by chairs I'd commissioned from a local artisan who specialized in sustainable furniture design. Tonight, we'd only need 8 seats, but I'd deliberately chosen to sit at the head of the table, literally and figuratively claiming the position that had always been Richard's by default. Emma arrived first, as she had for the past 3 months since starting her senior year. She'd become my regular dinner companion, stopping by every Wednesday after her advanced placement computer science class to work on coding projects and discuss her college applications. The MIT early admission decision came in, she announced. bursting through the front door with the kind of excitement that reminded me exactly why I'd fallen in love with her intellectual curiosity years ago. "And?" I asked, though her expression had already given away the answer. "I'm in." She pulled the acceptance letter from her backpack, unfolding it carefully as if it were made of precious metal. "Full academic scholarship. Plus, they want me to interview for their entrepreneurship program." I hugged her tightly, remembering my own acceptance letter 15 years ago, and how differently my family had reacted to that achievement. "I'm so proud of you, Em. You've earned every bit of this." "I couldn't have done it without you," she said, and I knew she meant more than just the college fund I'd established. Over the past months, I'd become the mentor I'd wished for at her age, someone who believed in her abilities without trying to redirect them toward more appropriate pursuits. Victoria and David arrived next, followed closely by Jonathan and his new girlfriend, Sarah, a software engineer he'd met at a Dataflow corporate event 3 months ago. It had been amusing to watch my brother navigate the revelation that the tech industry he'd dismissed for years was actually where many of the most interesting people were building their careers. Margaret and Richard were the last to arrive, still adjusting to the reality that family dinners now happened in their daughter's house rather than their own. The shift in dynamics had been difficult for them, not because of the change in venue, but because of what it represented about power and authority within the family structure. "How was your week?" I asked as we settled around the table, the conversation starter that had replaced the old pattern of them asking about my lack of direction. "Challenging," Victoria admitted. "The Morrison acquisition you facilitated has been more complex than I anticipated. Merging 4 law firms into a cohesive practice is like herding cats." "Good thing you're excellent at herding cats," I said, and meant it. Watching Victoria adapt to her new role as managing partner of what was now the largest corporate law firm in the Pacific Northwest had been one of the unexpected pleasures of the past 6 months. "The Jensen Technologies contract came through," Jonathan reported. $60 million over 3 years. "Thanks for making the introduction." I nodded, pleased that my brothers had finally started leveraging the business connections I'd offered, rather than pretending they didn't need my help. Pride, I'd learned, was expensive when it prevented you from building mutually beneficial relationships. "Dataflow's IPO expansion is moving forward," I said, sharing news I'd once kept entirely to myself. "We're launching in 3 new international markets next quarter, starting with the UK and Germany." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Margaret said, and I could hear her genuine effort to understand and celebrate achievements that still felt foreign to her worldview. The conversation continued through dinner, covering everything from Emma's college plans, to Sarah's insights about emerging technology trends, to David's observations about the intersection of law and artificial intelligence. It wasn't the awkward, performative exchange of my childhood. It was the kind of substantive discussion I'd always craved from my family. After dessert, as the others moved to the living room, Victoria lingered behind. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her voice carrying the hesitant tone she'd developed since learning I owned her firm. "Of course. Do you ever regret it? Keeping the secret for so long?" I considered the question seriously. "I regret that it was necessary," I said finally. "I regret that I couldn't trust you to love me without conditions. But I don't regret protecting myself while I built something that belonged entirely to me." Victoria nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that a lot, about how we made you feel like you had to choose between being successful and being loved. You made me feel like I had to be successful in ways you recognized in order to be loved," I corrected, "which isn't quite the same thing, but it was just as damaging." "I'm sorry," she said simply. "I'm sorry it took becoming your employee for me to really see you." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "We're here now. That's what matters." Later, after everyone had gone home, Emma and I sat on the terrace overlooking the city lights, planning her summer internship at Dataflow and discussing her ideas for social impact applications. "Do you think they really understand now?" she asked. "They're learning," I said, "and that's enough."